We will be developing our wall section in this video. We've almost completed most of our drawing. There's some fine-tuning that we want to do here, but what we need to do now is develop a drawing of a section which will then be located here on our sheet A-6. Now, a wall section is a partial section through a section of the house in some location. This is an example of one of the symbols that we may use in those sections. So, if I was to copy this symbol, which is a section mark, and bring it to, let's say, a location like here, I'm going to go ahead and I would stretch it out just a little bit more. So what we would be doing is actually taking a section through a partial section through the building here, all the way from grade through the foundation, through the wall, up through the roof, and then representing it as if we were looking down at it in this direction. So you can tell by the tail right here and the direction of the arrow that what we're going to do is cut a partial section through here. I'm going to go ahead and delete that right now. And we're going to be adding that when it comes time to do the annotations. But what we want to do is we want to cut the section through a typical section of the house that is not unique, that is something repeated over and over again. As I mentioned previously, usually a project will have a number of sections, but for this assignment and for this Marion project, we're only going to cut one. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a number of elements that are already existing in this drawing. I've brought these in recently, and they represent what we call blocks. Blocks are already pre-drawn items that when you bring them in, you can actually just repeat them over and over again. So our section will be composed of some blocks, and it will also be composed of typical line work. Let's take a look at our layer properties. We are going to do all our wall section drawings using a G anno symbol, G detail fine, G detail hidden layer, G detail medium, detail pat, which means pattern, the same as hatch, and G detail thin, and G detail wide. What we're going to do is draw all of our items using those different layers. Now the reason we're doing it with a G is because these layers can be used in a number of different sheets. So if we use the G represents general, we can use these same layers, which really are, if you take a look at over in here, is there's a modification in some line types. Typically they're continuous line types. They are different colors, but the line weights are different, so that when they're represented on a drawing, they will either stand out more, or if the items are in a distance, we can use the G detail fine. If we want to hatch something, we're going to do G detail pattern. We're going to go ahead and we're going to start with G detail wide, which is typically the line width that we're going to be using and the layer we're going to use. When we cut a section, we are actually cutting through part of the construction. The items that are cut, you want to represent as the thickest line possible. Items that are in the distance or hatch patterns, you want to do with the thinnest line possible. So we have a G detail fine here, which is a 0.05, and we have the G detail pattern, which is 0.00. That'll still print. Even though it says 0.00, the printers will always recognize it as something. So let's go ahead and let's start with G detail wide. We're going to make that our current layer. And I'm going to start locating my section right down here. I'm going to start with some line work. And as I draw this, I'm going to explain what the lines each represent. And we're going to have an accompanying video that'll explain what the construction of this actual house, this residence, is made of. All the way from the concrete foundation work, all the way through the CMU block walls, the rafters, the plates that we're using, and a lot of the detailing, the tiling, the stucco on the outside, the drywall on the inside. So we're going to represent all of that with blocks and line work. So the first line that I'm going to draw, I'm going to go ahead and draw a line that's going to represent our grade. If you take a look at our elevations, remember this line down in here represents our grade. This is where the building sits on. Now typically we show it as a straight line. That's not always the case, especially if you're building anywhere else other than Florida. The grade is going to vary, but for the representation here that we've done for the Marion, we're going to represent it as a horizontal line. So we're going to start with the G detail wide that represents our grade. If you remember from our elevations, the top of our slab is 4 inches thick, but it is 8 inches above that. So the best way to do that is to either offset or copy, and I'm going to go up 8 inches. And I'm going to go ahead and draw a vertical line that's going to represent the edge of our house, the edge of our concrete slab where the CMU is going to rest. Now I'll go ahead and bring that down 16 inches. I'm going to go 16 inches across, and then I'm going to go ahead and take my ortho off, and I'm going to draw a line up at 45 degrees. I don't care what length it is because I'm going to trim it out. I'm going to tab over, type in 45 degrees. Let me go ahead and type in 45 degrees for that line. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the line that we offset 8 inches up and offset it back down 4 inches. Now I'm going to go ahead and fillet these two lines. I'm going to fillet these two lines. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to trim this out. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and delete this line, because what we're going to do, even though this was our grade on the outside, our concrete slab on our house is what we call a slab on grade. And the type of footer that's going to be supporting our wall, which is here on the edge, is what we call a monolithic footer. It's monolithic because it's poured together with the slab. Now I've drawn this way over, extended it way over to here. We're really not going to need it that much, but we're going to go ahead and set some parameters on what the extent of our section is going to be. We can always modify that a little bit later, but this is going to represent our slab location right here, 4 inches, and this is our monolithic footer, also concrete. So all of this is concrete right in here, and this is our grade on the outside. So the next thing that we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw for now. I'm going to go ahead and using depth points, or I could use a construction line. I'm going to find out where depth points is in here. And I'm going to draw a line right here. That's going to be the extent of my wall section on the outside. I'm going to probably put break lines there later on. And I don't need to do it on this side because I'm not going to take this too far out into there. But what this does, it allows me to hatch the inside here with a concrete hatch pattern. For that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go to G detail pattern. I want to make sure I'm at the right scale. Then I'm going to go to the home tab and under modify, actually under draw, the draw panel, I'm going to click on hatch pattern. And when this comes up, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to scroll down to where we find architectural concrete. I'm going to click right in there, and as you can see, we have our concrete hatch pattern is located at that point. So even though this was the natural earth, our slab is called a slab on grade. So even though the grade was down 8 inches, we still have to fill in all the way to the bottom of the slab. So usually in the preparation of the soil, we prepare the soil by compacting it to make sure that it is going to have a sufficient strength to be able to support the loads that are going to be put on it by this structure, and so that it doesn't settle differentially, so that we don't get cracking or we get potential failure onto that. So there's a couple of items that we're going to do down below here. One of them is, once we compact the soil, we also termite treated it. In a lot of cases, we'll go ahead and we'll put a 4-inch gravel base, also well compacted to the correct compaction. And on top of that, we put what we call a vapor barrier. So I'm going to go ahead and I am going to change my layers here. I'm going to go ahead and go to G detail thin, and I'm going to, before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and offset this maybe 0.25, and I'm going to offset this line here and this line here. I'm going to fillet those two, and I am going to change that to G detail thin. So that's going to represent our vapor barrier that we've got underneath our slab. Now what I'm going to do is temporarily I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close this off, because I'll explain that later for what we're going to do. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go back to my G detail pattern located in there. I'm going to offset my vapor barrier 4 inches. I'm going to extend it to here, and making sure I'm in the right G detail pattern, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to highlight this right in here, and I'm going to change that layer to G detail pattern. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and hatch this with my gravel fill. So I'm going to go back to the hatch patterns. Let's take a look at where we can find some gravel. And we can open this up a little bit more and probably pull this out. So what we want to do is we want to find a gravel hatch pattern that is going to meet what we need. There's gravel. I'm going to go ahead and click that, and that's a little bit too small. So one of the things you can do when you do your hatch patterns is you can actually change the hatch pattern scale. So on this one I'm going to go ahead and try 2 and see what that looks like. That's still way too small. So I'm going to go ahead and close that out. I'm going to highlight it again. And let's go ahead and let's try 4. And that's a little bit better, maybe a little bit too big. I'm going to go ahead and set it to 3. And that's pretty satisfactory in terms of what I'm looking for. So what we're going to do now is we're also going to create now the well compacted fill that comes around through here. So maintaining the G detail pattern, I'm going to go ahead and create a border for my earth hatch that I'm going to do. So I am going to go ahead and I am going to use my polyline command, and I'm going to start somewhere maybe right out in here, and I'm going to go down, and all I'm going to do is just roughly. Now, I don't want to go too far because I don't want to run out of room. And then go up to this point. Now what I've also created here is a closed hatch pattern area that I can easily hatch. So I'm going to go back to my hatch right in here, and I'm going to look for, let's take a look for an earth pattern. So let's see what we got. Let's go back all the way up, and there's parquet, there's shakes. If we look at earth, there it is right there. I'm going to go ahead and highlight this right in here. And once again, it looks like it's coming in at too small of a scale. Again, what we are going to do with our section here, this is going to be shown at a much bigger scale than we show our floor plans and so on. So what we need to do is adjust this scale. And let's go ahead and with this one, let's try 12. That doesn't look bad. So what we can do is also change these later on. The one thing about this is that we are definitely going to want it to be in our G detail pattern layer because of the thickness of the lines that are going to be shown in there. The same thing with this one. But there's nothing that says that we cannot actually change the color. Okay, so instead of by layer, we could go to using some index colors. Let's see if we can go to index colors right in here. More colors right here. And let's just go ahead and select something that may make this a little bit more readable by having some variation in the colors. So that's going to represent that. I'm going to go ahead and change my gravel, and I'm going to change that color also. Let's go to more colors in here. I'm just going to go ahead with let's just try a gray tone right in here. And and I think that's fine. Now we can actually be checking this out as we go along. So let's see how much we've done already. I can also grip this. I don't want this stretching out so far over. I'm going to stretch that out into there. We could probably end up pulling this over. But let's do something right now. Let's go ahead and let's go to our wall section. Let's go ahead and open this up. And let's go to the point where we have started drawing. So this represents our section at this point. The problem is we need to make sure we're going to put it at the correct scale. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this down and put this at 3/4 inches equal to a foot. I'm going to right click and pan up a little bit. And for now that seems pretty good in terms of what we got going on. What we can also do is let's go ahead and let's make sure that our viewport is locked now, even though we can change it later on. So now when we zoom in, we can take a look at our work so far. There seems to be a couple of little issues in terms of maybe this vapor barrier line being too close to the rest of the drawing. I think we should be okay with that. The hatch pattern looks good. The hatch patterns for the soil is good, as is the gravel fill into there. So let's go back to our model space and let's start adding a couple of things here to our concrete slab and foundation. And what we're going to do is we're going to begin to use some of the elements that we've got shown in here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy this element right here. I'm going to go from the center point and I'm going to place it right here. This circle with the solid hatch in it, that circle is going to represent what we call reinforcing bars. And I'm going to do this with 3 bars. Again, this is going to be governed by what your structural engineer designs as a requirement based on the load, and it's also going to be based on code requirements. So what I have here is 3 bars that if you look at them, they're almost like an arrow pointing at us. So what you're looking is at the end section of a cut through. So these are called horizontal reinforcing. There's a certain amount of concrete that you need on all the way around them to provide what we call cover. And then the reason I shut this here before is because I did not want this hatch pattern to sneak its way into there. So we've got that reinforcing bar. So let's get these 3 horizontal reinforcing bars. We're going to have also vertical reinforcing, but for what we're going to show in this section, we're going to show those bars. And we're also going to show some welded wire mesh for the concrete slab. We're going to extend it. We're going to double extend it about 60 inches beyond that condition. Now the reason we use steel welded wire mesh or these reinforcing bars is because concrete is excellent in compression but terrible in what we call tension. So when you start applying loads here, believe it or not, the concrete will want to bend under stress. So since it is not very good in tension, we need to reinforce that concrete with reinforcing bars. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I am going to draw lines that are going to represent my welded wire mesh. So I'm going to go ahead and get out of the G detail pattern, drawing in here, and I'm going to go to thin. We can always change these later on. And I'm going to draw a polyline, and I'm going to go from about here up to this point, and then extend it out to here. Now, as I mentioned before, we are going to be doubling this up. So I'm going to bring this slightly up like that. Let's make sure we leave it roughly about the same. And I'm going to draw a line in here to see where my 60 inches. Now, each architect and engineer may want this doubling up a little bit different, but I'm going to go ahead and move that 60 onto there. And what I can go ahead now is bring that to line up at that point. So there's my double reinforcing around the perimeter wherever our walls are going to be located. I can now delete this. Let's go ahead and delete that. So what we now have is we have our foundation, concrete foundation, we have our reinforcing bars, we have our welded wire mesh, we have our gravel compacted fill on well compacted fill. So we're moving pretty good. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to start laying out our block onto here. Now, one of the things that I didn't draw yet is what we call a water stop. There is a recess. Some architects do 1.5 inches, other architects do 3/4 inches. In my office, we always did 3/4 inches. And I'm going to go ahead and bring that down 3/4, and I'm going to go ahead and offset this 7 5/8 inch this way. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and just offset it 8 inches. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and trim. And let me see if I can trim that out. All right. Now what we've done there is we've created that recess in here so that when we start building our block going up here, it actually sits in a small recess right there. Now what we can do is we can start adding our block, our concrete masonry units. Now this is what we call a block. This block has already been pre-drawn, as I mentioned before, and we brought it into the drawing. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and copy it, and from this point I'm going to go ahead and bring it down, put it right on the edge of the concrete slab. Now think of this as the first course that your masons would start building around your house. This represents right here, this represents your mortar that you're going to be using, and then we're going to repeat these until we reach the desired height before we do a tie beam across the top. Now the height of this is going to be determined by a couple of things. We wanted our ceilings roughly to be about 9 feet, but because construction is a modular type of construction, especially with block, we're going to be a little plus or minus on each one. We're also going to have this recessed 3/4, so we're going to modify it slightly. So all we need to do now, just like the masons would do out in real life, we're going to go ahead and we're going to start duplicating this. And we're going to start building our wall as we go up. Now, you could array it, you could copy a whole group and keep going, but for the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to keep building it up so that our wall is going to reach the level that we want it to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go back to depth points. I could use a construction layer, I could use almost anything that I want. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy this 9 feet up. Now what looks like is that I've gone a little bit beyond what I need to do, and our masonry units are going to stop short of the desired height right here. So what we're going to do is I'm going to delete the 2 top ones that I had drawn. I think we can go ahead and do one more. I think I deleted way too many. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and draw what we call a concrete tie beam. Now that concrete tie beam is formed, and usually it's a minimum of 12 inches deep, and it's the same width as the width of the CMU. So we are cutting a section through that, so I'm going to go here to G detail wide. And I'm going to draw a rectangle that's going to represent it right now. And I'm going to stretch it down this way. So this is 12 inches high. I'm going to delete my mark right there. And it's the width of the CMU block. Now this is something that you got to keep in mind. When we drew this house, we used what we call nominal dimensions. our walls are shown as 4 inches when in reality the studs that we're using are 3.5, and then they usually have a 1/2 inch of drywall on each side, or 5/8 depending on the quality of the house. The masonry unit that you have going on the exterior, we drew and offset at 8 inches. Again, that is a nominal dimension. The actual dimension of a block is not 8 by 8 by 16, but it's actually 7 5/8 by 7 5/8 by 15 5/8 long. So if we were to take a measurement from here to here, it's going to measure 7 5/8. If we take a measurement from here to here, it's going to be 7 5/8. Now our module from block to block is 8 because we are taking into account the 3/8 of an inch for the mortar. So what we now have is we can take a look and see where the top of that 12-inch beam is going to be. We can take a measurement, a distance measurement right here. And ideally we would have had 9, but remember we had a recess of 3/4 of an inch. So let's take a look at what happened. I am actually measuring from the top of the slab. Okay, so it shows it at 9 inches. Now let's take a look at what the size of this beam is. If I was to take its measurement, it measures 1 foot and 3/4. So I've actually made it a little bit too big. The minimum is usually 12 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stretch this down 3/4 of an inch. And then our distance from the top of slab to top of beam is going to be 8 foot 11 1/4 inches. So now I'm going to go ahead and go back to my detail pattern, and I am going to find the architectural concrete hatch one more time. Now when you're ready to hatch, there's a couple things you can do. So if you want to match properties, what this is going to do is actually look for existing hatch, and you can match the properties of that hatch right there. So now we've got a concrete beam, and this is called a tie beam because it helps tie all of the block together. Remember, these are 8 by 8 by 16 in terms of nominal dimensions that are all tied in and basically glued together. That's a terrible term, but using the mortar they are bonded together, but they're still separate items. So sometimes you need elements, whether it's reinforcing, filled concrete cells, etc., to tie them together. Again, we'll go into more detail in the complementary video that's going to show our construction methods. What we're more concerned here is the methods on how to actually draw your section. So just like this concrete here, this concrete in here needs to be strengthened in tension. So we are also going to go ahead and take our rebars and we're going to bring them on up. We're going to put 4 reinforcing bars in here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and mirror this here to here. Erase source object, no. Repeat the mirror command. I'm going to take the midpoint here. And what we have is 4 reinforcing bars, horizontal bars that go throughout the tie beam. So what this represents now is the height of the wall. If we take that measurement, if you go from here to what the top of the concrete slab here is, our measurement is now 8 foot 11 1/4. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remove this line right here. Now all of this is going to be annotated, and we're going to give dimensions and some other items that'll help define what we're doing. So now let's go back to our sheet and let's see what this is beginning to look like. Alright, so that's beginning to look pretty good. We've got our reinforcing bars, we've got our concrete slab located in here. I'm still a little bit concerned with this. I could theoretically change that layer right here to make it a little bit thinner. Let's go to Fine, G-Detail Fine, and that may give us a little bit more breathing room in terms of what we need. So that's looking pretty good. Let's continue with our drawing. Let's go back to model space. And now what we're going to do is we're going to use an older method of construction here. This is sort of the way that houses have been built up through the 60s and early 70s and so on, through 50s, 60s, and 70s. Currently, most construction is done with wood trusses, and they use reinforced masonry, bond beams, etc. But we're going to go ahead and show you the way that this was constructed previously. And eventually what we're going to do is do an alternative wall section here showing more current methods on how it's built. So the next thing that we do is, before we add our roof rafters, the roof rafters are the framing members that will rest on the wall and support your tile and your plywood sheeting, etc. So the first thing that we need to do is when you do your rafters, you don't want those rafters touching onto the concrete. The problem is that you'll get a chemical reaction that will begin to deteriorate the wood. So what we want to do is we want to create something that those rafters can rest on. And what we use is a wood top plate. The wood top plate undergoes what we call pressure treating, which it's infused with a chemical under pressure and heat that then protects it from the reaction that you get between masonry or concrete and the wood. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a 2x6 top plate that actually will once again go around the perimeter of the house. This is only a partial section through a section through one of the bedrooms. So what we're going to look at all of these blocks that we have in here. So if you look at the properties for that block is a 2x8. Now I may not have named this one. That's a 2x6, and this is going to be a smaller piece that we're going to use. That's a 1x3. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy all of these for now, and I'm going to bring them in a little bit closer that we have in here. So this represents my top plate. I'm going to go ahead and rotate it, put my ortho, and I'm going to locate it right from this point, locate it right in there. Now this top plate goes all the way around. Because we're in South Florida, and almost any location, this needs to be anchored solidly into this concrete tie beam that we have going around. So what we do is we place it in there and we anchor it with what we call J-bolts down to the concrete. Now these J-bolts are located in certain intervals. They need to be at the beginning and end of any singular pieces of wood that are on there. Again, for uplift capacity because of hurricane force winds, they will also be located certain distances apart, whether it's 2 feet, 4 feet, 4 feet, 30 inches, etc. Oftentimes they will also put a piece of insulation membrane underneath the wood to seal for any discrepancies between the wood and the concrete. But we don't have to show that, but we can indicate it with a note later on. So let's go ahead and let's start showing our anchors that we're going to use to hold down that top plate, pressure treated top plate. So we go back here and we go back to our details that we have in here, and let me see if I can find it. All right, so here we've got, I'm going to go ahead and copy that, and I'm going to copy that from here. I'm going to place it right in the center of that wood right there. So as you can see, it's a hidden line in here, and it protrudes out from the top plate, and then we've got we've got the bolt, we got the washer, and we got the screw going into there. So that has now anchored this top plate to our concrete tie beam. Now let's go ahead and continue with what we're showing next. The next element that we want to show is we want to complete our structure. So the next element that we're going to show is going to be our rafters. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull this line a little bit closer in this way. I don't think we need to show too much more than about to here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use that to trim. I'm going to trim all of this out down here. And that should be sufficient. Now, if you recall, our roof is at an angle of what we call 5 and 12. That's what we call the pitch. What that means is if I was to draw a line from anywhere on the roof over 12, it's always going to be in relationship to 12. And I come down 5, that should hit right on the roof. That means that 12 to 5 is the pitch of the roof. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. So I can actually do the same thing that represents this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I am going to go to G detail. Let's go with fine, because it's going to be in the distance. We're not going to be cutting through this rafter. We're actually just going to be looking at the side of the rafter. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw a line here. I'm going to go ahead and draw it using feet, 12 feet, and I'm going to go up 5 feet. Then I'm going to go ahead and tie it into this point right here. Now that's going to represent the bottom edge of my rafter. Now it doesn't necessarily have to be on this corner. Usually on a wood-to-wood connection you don't need the full bearing capacity that you have here. What you need is you probably need 2-3 inches. Code will describe what that capacity needs to be. So once again, just like what we were talking about, block only being 7 5/8 inches wide instead of the nominal 8, the same thing applies with wood. This is a 2x6. Well, that's our nominal dimension of a 2-inch by 6-inch piece of wood. The actual dimension for wood for a 2x6 would be 1.5 inches wide this way by 5.5 inches this way. So what we're going to do is since this represents the bottom of the side of the rafter, I'm going to go ahead and offset this. I'm not going to copy it up, but rather offset it. I'm going to offset it 5.5 inches. Let me go ahead and try that again. 5.5 inches. And that's going to represent the top of my rafter. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to extend it to my temporary line right here. And so now that is as if we were looking at the side of a piece of wood. That's a 2x6 rafter. And this is actually the wood in here. There's the top of it and the bottom of it. We're not cutting a section through it like we did here, but this is a 2x6 represented, as if we were cutting a section through it. All right, so what we need to do is we're going to be extending these lines down in this direction to where our overhang condition was. So I'm going to go ahead and, using any layer because I can change it later on or delete it, I'm going to go ahead and offset this. If you recall from our roof layout, we have a 2-foot overhang. So if we go back to our elevations here, there's a 2-foot overhang. If we go back to our floor plan, there's our 2-foot overhang. And typically the way that they do it in sections, and this is something that can be verified, we're going to go ahead and extend it, and it extends to where the end of the rafters or the trusses would be. So now, as I mentioned before, I can go ahead and delete this right there. Now, obviously this cannot work. So what we do is we actually cut this piece of wood. We cut it up this way and across to create a notch. So this is going to be eliminated from there. I'm going to go ahead and use the trim command. And trim it with that. And I'm going to remove this and remove this. And that cut is what's called a bird's mouth cut. So what it does, it allows this rafter, rather than resting on a corner, it provides a bearing length right here so that the corner of that rafter would not be crushed, plus it gives it more capacity in terms of the ability to bear on there. So there is our rafter. There's our top plates, top of tie beams, etc. Let's go back and let's save this drawing. We should be saving constantly. Let's go back to our wall section and see what it looks like so far. Alright, so we are beginning to develop this thing pretty well. I like the way it's looking. Okay, we could increase in our block, we could increase the width of our perimeter of the block, and I really also would like to change my block here. That looks like it's a little bit too thick. So I'm going to go ahead and make some adjustments to that and on the fly for the blocks that we're doing. So take a look at this. Once we modify one of the blocks so that we can change the layers on the block or a number of different things, it will change every block that's in this drawing. A block is something that's unique to this drawing. It's not something that you can copy and paste it onto other drawings, but a block does not create its own drawing. For that, we'll learn what we can do with something called a W block. It's a right block. So I'm going to go ahead though. I want to modify this because this obviously looks like it's a little bit too thick, and this one looks like it's a little bit too thin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this block first, and I'm going to edit block in place. There it is, my J-bolt. And I'm going to take a look at what layer I've got located, what I've indicated. That's G detail. Thin. Well, what I want to do is I want to change that, and that. I'm going to change those to G detail 5. And I think that's going to read a little bit better. So if you notice, everything else is grayed out and just the block is highlighted. So once you make the changes that you want, I may even change this one to even a thinner layer. Now let's just leave it at that for now. You have to save the changes, and if you take a look up in here, you've got on this panel for the edit reference, we need to actually finish the job and change the drawing. So let's take a look at how that resulted in our wall section, and if it looks a little bit clearer. Well, that looks pretty good to me. I still want to make some modifications to this part of this drawing right here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take this block, and I'm going to take it this one, and make sure to change my exterior perimeter of it to a different layer. Now again, these are blocks, so if you highlight it, that layer will not show up. That G detail thin or G detail pattern doesn't show up there. Why? Because they're nested. Those layers are nested within an A block layer that we've created. So what we're going to do is, once again, we're going to make some modifications. I'm going to highlight this one, right click, edit block in place. There's my wood 2x6. And I'm going to take this guy, and I'm going to change it from G detail medium to G detail wide. I'm going to save the changes. I'm going to take this one, right click, edit block in place. There's my 2x8. Highlight that, change that to G detail wide. Save the changes to that block. I'm going to do the same thing to this one. Edit block in place. That's my 1x3. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change that layer also to G detail wide and save the changes. So we've made those changes. Let's see what that looks like in the drawing, in our section on what we're going to be seeing. Alright, to me that looks a lot better. Looks like we've adjusted some of the thicknesses of the layer so that we're showing the elements that we're cutting through a little bit clearer. That looks very good. Now, there's just something I want to show you. We made the changes to copies of the blocks that we brought down in here. But because when you make a change to one of the blocks, it should change all of the same block that you have in this drawing. So whereas before this was an A detail medium layer right here, or color, Let's take a look at what it was over here. Now notice these have also changed, and notice this guy has also changed here. So that worked out excellent in terms of being able to use it. Alright, so what we have right here is we have our rafters then located. These rafters are going to be spaced every 2 feet. Again, that may vary depending on what the structural engineers or the spans may be, on what the size of the joist that you want to do, but that is very, very typical. Once again, dealing with the modularity of construction. So 2 feet, 18 inches, 48 inches, 12 inches, they're all multiples of 4, or 4 is divisible by those numbers. Again, you look at drywall, you look at plywood. Plywood is 4 foot by 8 feet. So what this provides is, if you have the structural members that you're going to screw in the plywood sheathing to, you want to make sure that you have an edge condition that's going to be screwed into it. So very, very important to maintain those dimensions so that you have the ability to hold down the structure and have those elements be tied together. The next element we're going to show is going to be our ceiling joists. Our ceiling joists also rest directly on this top plate. They're going to be directly horizontal. If we wanted a vaulted ceiling, we wouldn't have these. But I'm going to go ahead and use G-Detail Fine also for the ceiling joists. And usually they are located, at least in terms of when they rest on an exterior wall, they'll be located in the same direction, or they will be spaced in the same spacing that we have our rafters. Sometimes you'll bring them in at 18 inches instead of 2 feet, but that's not always the case. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to offset this also, 5.5 for our ceiling joist. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to trim this out, because in this case our ceiling joist is going to disappear when it's behind our rafter. So it's going to go here. We're going to do a cut on the end of that ceiling joist this way, and then bring this across to here. And the reason we're doing that is because if not, if this was a straight edge, it would be sticking up through our roof. So once again, that's a hidden condition, so I'm going to go to G-Detail Hidden. I go to the line command. I'm going to stretch that up to there, and I'm going to bring this one up to there. And I'm going to go ahead and use the trim command and trim that out. So that represents our ceiling joist behind that element. The next thing we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add my plywood sheathing here. And I've already downloaded again from another drawing or from a block that we've created from a detail book that we may have, or element book that we may have. So I'm going to go ahead and I've already put it at the right angle. If you had it horizontal or vertical, you can always use the rotate command and put it to the angle to match the pitch. I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and I'm going to copy it from this point. I'm going to go ahead and bring it down to here for now. Now again, I'm going to make a slight modification here later on, and it doesn't look like it reached all the way to the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my stretch command, and I'm going to stretch it beyond where I want it to. I want to make sure that stretches too, so I'm going to see if it's going to stretch again. Take that off. Alright, so this is not wanting to stretch. So what I need to do at this point is grab that hatch by the grip there, grab it by the grip here, and it stretches out to where I need it to be. Now I'm going to use my depth point line here as a trimming element, and there we have the plywood sheathing on top of our rafters. Now the reason I said I was going to modify this, because what we want to do is we want to go ahead and bring in what we're going to call a fascia board that goes around the perimeter of each one of the rafters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this element that I copied, I'm going to go ahead and move it, use the move command. I'm going to place it right here for now. Now, if I was to draw a line in here, and we put our flashing and everything else that's going to come in a minute up into here, what I really want to do is I want to move this slightly down, like that. So what we end up having is this element here. I'm going to go ahead and move it. I'm going to move it down. I'm going to take my ortho off, and I'm going to move this guy down like that. Now what that's done is allowed for a smoother transition without an uptick for any flashing that we may have in here. Now of course I need to go back over here, and I need to extend a couple of lines again, including the hatch. And let's take a look at what this looks like now in our drawing. I'm going to go back to the wall section. And looks like a lot of lines are occurring there, but I think that's going to be okay. Now remember, this drawing is going to be 36 inches by 24 inches. So what we're seeing right now is not quite what we're going to see printed. I think what we want to do is let's go ahead and let's do a preview and see what that looks like. So that's beginning to look pretty good for the section that I want. There may be some slight modifications we're going to want to do, but for now I'm pretty happy with it. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's go back to our model. Let's move our drip edge and let's bring that down also. And so once again, we don't want an uptick in here, so I may end up moving both of these down just a little bit, or I could even move this one. Again, this would be something that typical field condition might resolve. But I think it's something that we could easily fix. Like for example, if I wanted to draw a line from here to here, use it as a guideline, draw just something I can extend to over here. I'm going to use my extend command and stretch this out. I'm actually okay even if I had it to where I was before. So I can bring this up and bring this up a little bit like that. Alright, so we've got that condition. One thing they're not going to do, and I've seen people draw this, where they will draw the plywood so that it just rests flat onto here. So it's no one's going to rip a piece of plywood at an angle like that at the edge. I think that's going to be something that you don't want to do. So let's go ahead and let's bring our metal flashing in here before we start adding any of the roofing materials that are going to be indicated up on the top of the roof. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go here. And I am going to copy. Let's see what we've got. This is going to represent our flashing. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to bring it in. I'm going to place it here. And we don't want it flat on there because we still want to be able to see the differential between one and the other. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to visually modify this a little bit. I'm going to take my ortho off and I'm going to put this somewhere about like that. And that's going to represent my flashing. And on top of that, we're going to go ahead and draw our roofing materials. Not our tiles, but the underlayment below that, the waterproofing that's going to go on top of the sheeting. I want to take a look at this to make sure that it's going to be represented pretty well. A little bit tight in there because of the thickness of this line, so I may pull this up a little bit more. Let's go ahead, and it's a little bit tight here also. Again, part of this is representation of what it's going to be looking like. So I'm going to pull this up just a little bit more and a little bit out. I'm going to go back and take a look at it one more time. And to me that looks a little bit better on how that's going to be represented. Each firm is going to have be looking at things a little bit differently. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw a line. I'm going to draw it from here. I'm going to go ahead and go back to this layer. This layer right in here was, that is created as a block, but I'm going to go ahead and go to a different layer. I'm going to go to G-Detail Thin at this point and draw a line from here all the way to the end. I'm going to go ahead and move this up. Put my ortho back on. And I'm going to draw a line from here to here. And I'm going to move that one up a little bit. Now that's going to represent my overlap of the roofing material over the flashing. And then I'm going to go ahead and do this at an angle like this. And trim that out. Now depending on how your company wants to show you that, the length of the flashing may be different. How far this overlaps depends on the type of roof that you're going to be using, etc. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and I am going to copy this. Represents, and I want to make sure I get both pieces. I'm going to copy. I'm going to remove this because I accidentally got it. I'm going to bring this over and bring it over to here. Now, this is not exactly what it's going to look like, but it's representative of what we're going to be showing. So what we do want to see is to make sure that it stays a consistent distance from what we're indicating. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move P for previous. Actually, I'm going to move this element and this element. And I'm going to go ahead and bring it down to this point somewhere. Now again, this is going to be a little bit different oftentimes so that your last tile is at the same pitch as these. That's going to be raised a little bit from there. We'll take care of that a little bit later, but that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and trim this out. And what we now have is we have our tile, we have our roofing material on top. Now something's a little bit up. I'm not really happy with the scale of this tile. If this is 2 by 6, this is really tiny in terms of what that tile is. So I'm going to use a scale command, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take it from this point and I'm going to make it twice as big. That to me looks a little bit better in terms of what potentially the size of the tile might be. I'm going to go ahead and trim this out. Might still be a little bit too small, but I'm pretty satisfied with what I've got into there. Let's take a look at it again, add all. And there's our section. Now if we wanted to do this much more detailed, we could, but for this exercise and this project, we're going to go ahead and leave it the way it is. Now I also want to take a look at this and see what it looks like when we're going to print it. So I'm going to go there, continue. Let's do a preview, and let's see what we're looking like. Okay, that doesn't look bad at all. Alright, now notice that this line, when we did the preview, is not showing up. That's because it's on depth points. That was the intent. We did not want to see that line. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to put our stucco finish. We have a stucco soffit along the bottom. We also have stucco along the outside. We're going to go ahead and add our insulation here. We're also going to add what we call a baffle in here, which will allow for, we have a vent at the bottom of the rafters on our soffit, which will allow for circulation to go through. We're going to do a couple of other items that you would normally have that are called rat runs and so on. I don't know if we're going to show that on here. We have what we call metal hi-hats, and I'll explain why we are having those if we have ceiling joists here where we can put our drywall up against. But let's go ahead and let's start drawing our stucco on the outside. Now the stucco on the outside we're going to go ahead and show as a G detail wide. Let me see if I can find it. And I'm going to go ahead and draw it from here to here and bring it on down. Now I'm going to move the one I just drew this way, and I'm going to move it over, let's say 7/8 of an inch. And I'm going to move this guy. Actually, I'm going to offset it. This way. Make sure to delete it from there. And extend it to this end. Now, if it won't extend because this is a block, the easiest way that you can do this is you can use your stretch command. And if you take it off, you can try to do if you do polar tracking, let's see what we've got in here. And we've got object snap tracking is on, so it should, you know what I'm going to do for now, I'm just going to go ahead and draw a line from here. That'll be part of another demonstration. I'm going to go ahead and extend this so that it seals it off, and then I'm going to delete this. Alright, so this represents our stucco. Our stucco can go directly onto the block. Our block is a solid surface, and it's textured so that using the proper number of coats for the stucco, it will adhere easily. The problem here is that we are not, these rafters here occur every 2 feet roughly. So what ends up happening is, how do you stucco against the air between those 2 feet? Well, we use what we call a high rib metal lath. It's a self-furring metal lath. And that element is this element that we have here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy it. And I'm going to bring it from here. And I'm just going to place it in there. And I'm going to copy it enough times so that we cover the entire area that it needs to be indicated in. Now that should be about there. And I'm going to trim it out here. There we go. Alright, so there's our high-rib metal lath with our stucco surface on the bottom of it. Now let's go ahead and let's install our vent. I've also located the vent. By the way, in some cases you may have to rotate these in a different direction and so on. Because they're not all going to be 5 and 12 pitch. I'm going to go ahead and put this one right in here. And again, this can vary the type of vent that you do. Before, we always used to have this in, let's undo that for a second because I trimmed way too much out of that. So I need to use this element. And let's see if it's going to trim this time. Now it's taking off the whole thing. So unfortunately, got to do this again. I'll draw a line down here. I'll use that and that element to trim. And let's get that out of the way. And let's get this out of the way. And there we go for the vent. You actually do have a very thin line going out there, so I'm going to actually use the thinnest that we've got, G-detail fine, or you can actually even use the pattern, which is even thinner. And I'm going to go ahead and grab it by its grip there and put it right to there. Alright, so there's our vent. You are required a certain number of square inches per the square foot of attic space that you have in your house. You also have other requirements of, if you have over 3,000 square feet, you need to separate sections of that roof. All right, that's looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and let's bring in our insulation. So let's go ahead and take this element. I'm going to go ahead and copy it. This is what we call batt insulation, and a number of things vary in terms of how much heat resistance it actually provides. You have R19, R30, etc. So I'm going to bring this all the way over to here, and I'm going to trim this out here. Let me see if I can do that. There we go. All right, and that is our insulation. Again, you've probably seen it. It's pink, and it can be itchy, and it actually lays in between either the rafters, the trusses, or the ceiling joists in here. It's got paper on one side, and it's stapled to the bottom surface of the structures. Now, one of the things that we got to worry about is if we do this batt insulation, and most contractors do this well, so there is not too much of a problem in terms of blocking this vent from venting the attics. That's the purpose of what that vent is. But right now, if we had jammed all this in here, that would create a little bit of a problem. So I didn't have a block for it, but what we can do is we can actually create one at this point. We're going to create what's called a baffle, and they have prefabricated plastic baffles. Some people make it with wood and plywood or with drywall. And what it basically does, it's going to create a channel in between the rafters that's going to allow for the air to circulate through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use a layer, let's call it G-detail thin. And I'm just going to go ahead and draw a rectangle, make it about, let's make it 2 feet by 3/4 of an inch. And I could actually make it a little bit less than that. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make it 6 inches less. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw a line. I'm going to use a thinner layer even. Let's say G-detail fine. And I'm going to draw another rectangle. And this time, let's make it 18 by 1.5. And what we need to do is we have to make sure that we get sufficient coverage for that air to go through. So this may be too much, maybe too little. It all depends on what we're going to calculate is the amount of air that's going through here. So we may even be able to make this less, but for now let's see what we get. I'm going to go ahead and move this. I'm going to get it at the right angle, and then I'm going to locate it accurately. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the rotate command. I'm going to use this as my base point. Then I'm going to use what we call a reference angle. My reference angle is my existing angle, and my new angle is this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that baffle and I'm going to move it up into this space, and I'm going to see how that looks. Now, to me it looks like I've got a little bit too much there, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to redo this. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy this one from here to here, change that to the right layer that I wanted to, which was G-detail fine. Sure, that's G-detail fine, and then I'm going to move it up and locate it accurately to where I want it. That looks much better. I'm going to move it even up a little bit more. Now, a lot of contractors and a lot of builders won't even do this. So let's get this out of the way in here so we can clean this up. And we can get rid of this. Now the last thing that we can do is, depending on the material, we're not going to specify what this material is in here, but we're going to go ahead and change it. We're going to create a hatch pattern. And I'm just going to use a very simple hatch pattern. Let's go ahead with, let's go all the way to the top with just a simple pattern like that. 2 for our baffle. That could even be less, but for now let's go ahead and we can modify this later. I'm going to change my scale here and change it to 2. And let's see what that looks like. Okay, so there's our baffle, located right there. All right, that's looking pretty interesting. There's our insulation, our roof materials. Let's go ahead and let's go back to the model. And let's start doing some of the materials and items that we're going to do on the inside. So what we've got is we've got our stucco located on the outside. Now we can start, let's finish the inside and see what we get. Now one of the things that we want to do with this stucco before we do that is we want to bring this stucco and bring it down below the earth at this point. So I'm going to bring it down a little bit. I want to make sure to get to the right layer, which was GD till wide. And I'm going to go ahead and draw something like that. Go ahead and stretch it down just a little bit more. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and trim out. Trim that out, trim that out. And that represents our stucco on the outside. Now if you wanted to add a hatch to that, we could. I have no problem leaving it the way it is. We could do this at 3/4 of an inch. I did it at 7/8. So if you do want to add a hatch pattern, a dot hatch pattern would be good. Just think about the thickness of the layer that it's going to be when it prints. Remember, dots are very difficult to see if you put them in too thin of a layer. So there's a little fine balancing that you need to do there for that. All right, let's go ahead and let's finish up doing the inside. Now the first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and we're going to use a 1/2 inch drywall up against the concrete or the concrete masonry units here. But it can't go right up against it. So what we're going to do is we're going to create what we call furring strips. Furring strips are vertical items of wood, 1x3s or 1x2s, which would be these elements here. And for the height of the wall that we're going to do, we're going to locate 3 of them. So we're going to locate one at the top. I'm going to move this up a little bit. And this is going to provide nailers for the drywall. For our drywall going this way. And it also has a very, very important function. If our wall is higher than 8 feet, which it is, we need to have one of these roughly at midpoint. And then we're going to put one last one on the bottom, which is going to represent a nailer for our baseboard and the bottom of our drywall. Now we don't know what the finish is for this house yet. Let's call it a speculative house. It's a sample house. So what we're going to do is for now we're going to show a hidden line here that's going to represent our future floor finish to be selected by owner or later on when we coordinate with the interior designers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just draw a line here, from here to here, and I'm going to move it, and let's just move it up about 1 inch, and let's readjust this, and I'm just going to pull this over to the edge, even though it really never does that. So that looks pretty good. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's put our drywall, our vertical drywall here. So if you take a look at this material, I'm going to go ahead and copy it. We're also going to be using it in the ceiling, so rather than having to copy that one twice, I'm going to bring one over to here. I'm going to go ahead and do it. I'm going to do that one, and I'm going to rotate it. Make it vertical on our F8. I'm going to move P for previous, and I'm going to bring that guy down and place it somewhere down in here. Now it doesn't go all the way down to the bottom, obviously, because oftentimes you will want your finished floor and so on to actually extend into there. Now 1 inch is pretty good for what we've got for our finished floor in there. We could move it down a little bit, but if you have if you want to do a marble floor or a granite floor, you would have a setting bed that is that together with the marble was probably going to be even more than 1 inch. So there's a lot of things you need to take into account. Let's go ahead and let's take this guy, and I am going to bring it all the way up to here. Now again, it really doesn't do that. You'll always stop a little bit short. We're talking about real construction. So let's take a look at my hatch and see where it ended up, because it did not stretch with it. So it looks like my hatch ended right here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try to stretch it again. And I can't seem to grab it. Let's go ahead and see if I can actually grab it by. It doesn't have an interior grip. I may end up having to hatch this whole thing separately. Alright, so what I'm trying to get done here is what I'm trying to do is get this hatch on this block to go up through it. Now I'm taking each side a little bit at a time and bringing it up and see what happens with it. Looks like it's going up in stages, so that's something that I may want to take a look at later on to deal with the problem in here. So let's go ahead, and we've got this one located in here. Now what we've done is with the drywall is actually located, this blank space that you have in here is your vertical furring strips, and the furring strips are about every 18 inches on center. Sometimes they'll double them up. There's actually insulation, which is called an alfoil insulation. It's about a 4.2 R value onto it, and what that does, it allows for additional insulation for the walls. So it really isn't a blank space. What this space also does, it allows for the electrical boxes, conduit if you have any, or your Romex might go through there to help you get some of the electrical wiring, the boxes, the outlets, etc. that are going to go there. Now the reason that we've got this intermediate 1x3 here, and sometimes they'll use 1x2s, and the same thing here, is because they create what's called a fire stop. So if you have a short circuit and in one of the boxes and it starts a fire, rather than going immediately up through here and into this fuel rich environment of the wood trusses or rafters in this case and so on, what this does, it won't stop it, but it'll delay it, so that fire from spreading, including the smoke, etc. So we have one at the top here, always the transition between the wall and the ceiling or roof, and then the other one, if depending on the height of the wall, you may require an intermediate fire stop in between. Alright, so now it's time to go ahead and put our drywall up on the ceiling here. So let's go ahead and use the same 1/2 inch drywall that we're using before. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and I'm going to take it from this point, and for now I'm going to put it right here. Now I'm not going to bring it all the way up there, because what we're not going to attach this to the bottom of our ceiling joists. Our ceiling joists, at least what's indicated in this project, are going to be at 2 feet on center. When you use a 1/2 inch drywall, what ends up happening is if you attach that drywall every 2 feet, you're going to get some waviness because it's not really that thick. So in some cases, some people will go to 5/8 inch drywall. The same thing applies for the furring strips here. The furring strips vertically are at every 18 inches. You don't want your walls to be wavy. So what we need to do is we need to apply something that we can screw in our drywall that's going to be at 18 inch intervals so that we don't get that waviness. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and trim this out for now right here. And let's do one more trim. And before I move it up, I'm going to go ahead and move what we call metal hi-hats. Those are these little elements right here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy it. I'll copy it from this point. And I am going to place that right here. And I'm going to place my drywall at that location. Now, I could move this further over before we finish this. In fact, I think I'm going to do that. Again, sometimes the guys out in the field will know exactly the way that they want to do this. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this down just a little bit, like that. I'm going to go ahead and move this back up. And shift this over so that we have this coming up like that. Gives us a little closer connection. I'm going to go ahead and move these elements now. And I'm going to bring this up. And bring it up against there. Now, I'm going to make sure also that this is spaced at the 18 inches that I talked about before. So that's 18. I can copy it again at 36. And I would copy it again at 48, but that's going to be beyond our cut right here. So now we have our top of our ceiling located in here, our walls, our wall finishes located in there. There's a couple more things that we can add in here. Let's go ahead and let's do a couple of things. I'm going to go ahead and add a baseboard at this point. And we've got some millwork here that we're using for the baseboard, so I'm going to go ahead and copy this from this point down here. And I'm going to go ahead and bring it to here. Now this is never really going to be exactly like that, and sometimes you might have another quarter round in here to finish up the baseboard located in there. I think that's looking pretty good. Let's see what other elements we may have, but this shows pretty good what we've done so far. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bring this up to here and here. I don't think we need anything in here. I think we've used all of these elements already in our drawing. The one thing we did not do, we talked about anchoring our top plate down to the concrete, but we haven't talked about anchoring our rafters down to the top plate. So what we're going to use here is we're going to use a gusset plate. Again, typically with, let me go ahead and bring that in. Okay, I accidentally got out of the drawing. What we're going to do is use this gusset plate. With wood trusses and so on, you might use what we call hurricane straps, or you can use a hurricane clip. Again, this is something that will be worked out together with your engineers and code requirements. But for this, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to show one right into there. Now, it looks like it's crowded in a little bit with this baffle. So what we may want to do is let's go ahead and modify this a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and go to Edit Block in Place. Do OK. And I didn't really have the size of this. I think I stretched it up a little bit too much when I first drew it. So I'm just going to go ahead and modify that. And I think this will be more like the actual dimension that it is. And I should have done both of these at the same time. Okay. Now again, this is not located wherever these are all the time, so that's not going to create a problem there at all. So there we go. Now let's take a look at what this looks like in our wall section. That may, by the way, may be a little bit too much detail for what we're doing. Plus I might make this a little bit thinner to pull this up a little bit. So these are all the type of details you have to worry about when you're designing. All right, so there's our wall section. That's looking excellent. We're going to do some fine tuning before we finish up these drawings. There is our plywood sheeting. That's actually looking very good. Let's go ahead and let's do a zoom all on this. I'm going to go ahead and remove this. Okay, let's do a zoom all. And let's go sheet by sheet and see how far we've gotten. Now, one of the things that we're going to do in one of the coming videos is to annotate. And that's extremely important. So every single one of these sheets is going to have quite a bit of information on it, describing on how to construct this house. So we've got our site plan. We're going to have a lot of information here. Each one of these, the floor plans, each will have unique sets of dimensions and notes for each one. So I'll see you at the next video.